What I'll do in this talk is, first of all, just tell you a little bit about the Data Justice Lab and this whole idea around talking about data justice and why we sort of think that's important. And then I'll talk specifically about a project that we did, which we completed, or published the report for in December, which tried to sort of map the uses of data and predictive analytics in particular in local authorities, councils and local authorities for public services. So very much about what kinds of systems are being implemented for making decisions about the provision of public services. And I'll sort of highlight some of the issues and concerns that we also found with doing that project, speaking to also sort of stakeholders and people who represent impacted communities. So first of all, just then the Data Justice Lab. So this is who we are at the moment. So we are sort of a team of around 10, 11 people. I direct the lab together with Arne Hintz, Joanna Redden, and Emiliano Trere. And then we have a number of PhD students, postdocs, and research assistants who help us as well. And just a bit about where we're sort of coming from, just so you know, which will also inform sort of, I guess, my take on some of these issues. So we officially launched in March 2017, although we sort of started this idea around setting this up prior to that. And we are situated within the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University, and that sort of also shapes our approach. We're social scientists coming to this topic, so we're not technologists, although we do work with computer scientists, and one of our postdocs is a computer scientist. But we have then this expanding team, but predominantly we come to this topic as social scientists. And we have a number of different projects that we work on. So I work on a 5-year project funded by a starting grant from the European Research Council, which is on data justice, this idea, so understanding datafication in relation to social justice. But then with the others, I also work across a number of different projects. So the one that I'll talk about specifically is this one on data scores, so investigating uses of citizen scoring in public services. But then we also try and engage with policy and regulatory frameworks that are in place. And my colleague, Joanna Redden, has a data harms record, which is on the website, which tries to actually provide sort of illustrative, concrete examples of the types of harms we might be talking about when we're talking about data and the use of data systems in different contexts. And then we've just started a new project, which is this one on towards democratic auditing, which is really about trying to think about ways in which to have a more inclusive discussion around the implementation of systems that considers civic participation much more and what role citizens should have in the implementation of data analytics, predictive analytics, particularly in government and in where public services are being provided. We also actually try and be quite sort of practice-oriented in some ways, I guess. So although we're academics, of course, we organize academic conferences. We had a big conference last year on data justice, where we had sort of over 200 participants, scholars and practitioners who came to that conference. But what we also try and do a fair bit of is do sort of what we might kind of call scoping workshops or stakeholder workshops, where we try and bring people together to find out what is happening in different areas, and combining sort of practitioners and civil society, and also different parts of civil society. And one of the things that we found in our work and our rationale for setting up the Data Justice Lab was in part to try and sort of identify common concerns amongst different stakeholder groups that at the moment are not very connected or have never really been very connected, between concerns with sort of technology and concerns with social justice, if you like, which haven't always been in dialogue. And then we also try and engage with the policy process. And because we are in a journalism school, we're not part of the sort of journalism school part of the department, but Cardiff University has a big journalism school where a lot of journalists do get trained. And because we're situated within that, we do try and take advantage of that by engaging with journalism educators and trainers to try and think about how we can improve the reporting of these developments. Because one of the things that we have is actually a kind of lack or a problem with a lack of proper comprehensive reporting on developments, in part because it's very difficult to research this or to investigate this. And actually what we're trying to see if, in many ways, the sort of skills that we need as social scientists to investigate these developments are things that can actually actually be transferred also to journalism education. So we try and also think about that, and we've developed certain tools for journalists as well that they can use to try and improve on that aspect, so kind of algorithmic accountability reporting, if you like. Now, in terms of where we then are coming to, the kinds of concerns that inform, or the agenda that informs our research. Originally, actually, we came to some of these, a lot of the different people in the lab, we've sort of united around a concern with digital technologies, digital media, and the societal implications of what's happening with developments in digital technologies. And initially, we looked at that in relation to questions of digital surveillance and this mass collection of data for intelligence services and security services. But actually, what we found is that this kind of logic of understanding people and understanding societies through data is something that is happening across social life and not just confined to intelligence agencies or security services. So we have what we might think of increasingly, we're moving towards a sort of datafied society where there is this logic of that you can use data and algorithmically process data for the purposes of decision-making about which will impact on people's ability to participate in society. So whether that's whether someone can cross a border or not, the nature in which we might get hired or fired for our jobs, or even, if we go to prison or not, is at least increasingly being influenced by this kind of logic around algorithmic decision-making. The ProPublica story there is obviously the one that always gets highlighted as the sort of the one that's to illustrate the extent to which this might be happening. But this is these are the types of developments that sort of we are concerned with within the Data Justice Lab, which is probably also quite different understanding of what data can do than what we just saw in the previous presentation. And the reason that we are sort of our framing or our entry point into this discussion comes a bit with a recognition about a need to change our understanding of what is actually at stake with these developments. Because what we found, certainly sort of initially when we did, I don't know where that comes up separately, I'll just put all of them there. What we found sort of initially also looking at public debate and media debate, which is also something that we've looked at about mass data collection, the dominant framing has often been a kind of binary, if you like, between an idea that this is a trade-off between greater efficiency, more security, particularly state security, that this is what these technologies can do. They can advance efficiency and security, but what's at stake is concern with individual privacy and the protection of personal data. Often we're sort of invited to think of it as this kind of trade-off between these two things. But what we've had in recent years especially is a host of research and publications that have illustrated how limited this framing actually is, and it doesn't really capture what is actually at stake with these types of technologies and the way in the context in which these technologies are being implemented. So we've had people who write about the extent to which this also challenges the democratic process, because there's a question about a lack of transparency that accompanies the implementation of these technologies, in part because they are black boxed, if you like, but also a general question about the role that private companies now come to take in government functions. So Frank Pasquale has written The Black Box Society, but has also talked about a shift from sort of territorial sovereignty to functional sovereignty, where private companies take on these kind of state functions, right, and governance roles, and what that does for our understanding of democracy. But then we've also had a lot of discussion recently about the extent to which these systems tend to have a tendency to discriminate, in part because often they're based on skewed data sets, for example, that have been based on discriminatory practices that they get reinforced through the use of these kinds of technologies, or because of the way in which algorithms, certain variables are weighted in algorithms, and then what comes to count can have discriminatory outcomes. But also that we're not all equally implicated in this. We're not all equally positioned. We don't get monitored in the same way or for the same purposes as people. So actually, we need to root this in questions of social and economic inequality to understand what's actually at stake. And then generally speaking, there is a recognition about the extent to which we are increasingly identified or recognized in society through algorithms, through our data double, as people call it, and what that does for our identities, because there's a concern here with the reductionist nature of those types of recognition, if you like, of people, right? So this is the John Cheney Lippel book in We Are Data deals very much with this question of algorithmic identity and the kinds of injustices that might emerge. And that's the data harm record then there that my colleague Joanna Redden has started. So all these kinds of discussions really privilege a much broader sort of social justice concern with what is at stake with these technologies. And that's sort of the kinds of questions that we're trying to deal with in the Data Justice Lab, but then sort of suggests a reframing of the debate that privileges social justice concerns. So hence this kind of notion of data justice. So it is those kinds of questions that we are concerned with. And it also means that we have to have a different entry point into thinking about some of these issues that considers these social questions, social structures, context, questions of inequality, issues of discrimination in our society when we are looking at these technologies, rather than just focusing on the data system itself and trying to deal with sort of bias and so forth within the technology itself. It really needs to be a much broader kind of contextual entry point. And that also therefore informs our approach to our project. So this is the project that I wanted to talk about, which is this project that has looked at data scores, as we've called it, which is really about this categorization and assessment and prediction about individuals or populations done through data collection and predictive analytics. And so what we tried to do to that was to somehow, because there isn't actually a list over what local or central governments are doing in this regard. So this is something that has been recommended that they might produce, but currently we don't have that. So we try to do it for them. So we tried to somehow map what was going on. And we did that in different ways. We did it in part by actually scraping government websites based on a number of keywords associated with algorithms, predictive analytics, data analytics. So we sort of tried to collect that. Obviously, we couldn't verify all of that, so that's not a definitive list. But it gave us a database that actually this is the database we've also created for journalists to be able to go through and see. You can sort of do searches on there to see if there are any if you wanted to dig deeper. But we also then used freedom of information requests. So we sent out 423 freedom of information requests to all local authorities and councils to ask about their uses of data analytics. And I'll talk a bit about what we found doing that. But then we also identified 6 case studies across, so for benefit fraud, for child welfare, and for policing across the UK, so tried to get some geographical spread as well, and talked with developers of these systems and managers in the councils as well as frontline staff about their uses of these technologies. And then we also really, very importantly, wanted to include stakeholder voices. So we also spoke with civil society organizations that work with service users or work with sort of impacted communities to try and understand concerns coming from there. And we also did some multi-stakeholder workshops and some work with journalists about this. But I'll just move on quickly. Just to talk about some of the stuff that we found. So from our freedom of information request, we were able to identify 53 councils that say that they use some form of predictive analytics for purposes of public services. We also can combine that with, so Liberty around the same time, we're also doing freedom of information requests to police forces, which we didn't include in our freedom of information request. And then they identified, based on that, 14 police forces that use algorithmic decision-making for policing. And what we found is it's a very varied landscape, right? And this is obviously not a comprehensive list. It's also one of the problems we have is that local authorities and councils themselves don't know what constitutes predictive analytics, so there's a kind of interpretive vacuum, if you like. So it's kind of a little bit of a, we had to sort of try and figure out, does this count as that, or what is it actually, is this what we're talking about when we're talking about predictive analytics in local authorities or algorithmic decision-making in local authorities? And so this is obviously not a complete or comprehensive list, but it gives us some indication. And some of the things that we found is that it's very different how local authorities are approaching this. So some are developing in-house, so some have their own data scientists developing these systems. But also we found that there was quite a lot of few prominent players that were actually being contracted in many different local authorities. And in particular, this was then Capita, Centura, Call Credit. And then we also found that Experian gets used an awful lot by local authorities for population, sort of household level data, which when we asked why why they use Experian in many cases because they feel that their data is better than the data that they have themselves, right? So it's an interesting kind of thing that's happening there about consumer data being mixed with citizen data and things like this. Now, the prominent areas in which these kinds of systems are being used are put in this idea of benefit fraud, so identifying the potential of benefit fraud, but also in child welfare, so in predicting child exploitation or child abuse, and also in predictive policing, right? So these are kind of dominant areas. And when we're talking about citizen scoring, the type of thing that we're talking about is either sort of, so in many, not all of these systems produce scores, right? So, but some of them produce some form of assessment, and it's particularly to do with identity verification. So that's in benefit fraud. So the likelihood that someone is the same person across different records. And that's a way in which to try and identify whether there are issues about people living where they shouldn't be living and claiming benefits they shouldn't be and things like this. But then it's also for risk assessment. So actually producing a kind of risk score for the likelihood that somebody is being exploited or abused, or for example, or the likelihood that someone might commit a crime. So this is another way in which we can talk about citizen scoring, or the ranking of offenders, for example, where you have high-risk offenders being ranked high and lower-risk offenders being ranked low, right? So these are the kinds of developments that we're talking about. I'm a little bit conscious of time, but this just to give you two examples. So the one is Bristol's Integrated Analytical Hub, which is essentially, so the general trend that we found with local authorities is they're looking to sort of create what they describe as data warehouses, which is integrating lots of data sets across councils and sometimes also partner agencies to create what they describe as a kind of golden view or single view of a household or a citizen. But what we then also find is on top of that, in places like in Bristol, for example, what they've developed is then also a predictive analytics system to do with trying to predict child exploitation. And that's essentially based on about 35 different social issue data sets that then produce a kind of score. And that score is based on behaviors and characteristics of previous victims of child abuse or child exploitation. And then, so they try and apply that to all young people within Bristol, and then everybody has a score of that. So that's the kind of thing as one case study. The other one is then Avon and Somerset police who use, I realize these are both now Bristol-based case studies, but there are also ones from elsewhere. But this is Avon and Somerset police who use ClickSense, which is data application kind of service that have lots of different applications. And one of the things that they try and do with that is precisely this ranking of risk offenders and producing a risk score for existing offenders about the likelihood of them reoffending, right? So this then shapes very much the way that they organize their policing within Avon and Somerset police. And they also do neighborhood mapping, which is a more common practice amongst police, where you try and predict what neighborhoods are more prone to crime based on lots of different types of data. So those are the two examples. So now just to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and concerns that we are sort of confronted with when we are looking at these types of developments. So from our interviews with local authorities and police forces, is one of the, I think, interesting things about this that came out in all of our case studies is the extent to which that the reasoning for turning to these technologies is very much an austerity context. So this is, so councils in England have had something like 60% of their funding cut since 2010. Councils are trying to deal with this situation, and one of the ways in which they are doing that is to turn to these kinds of data-driven technologies as a way to refocus, as they would say, their resources in a particular way, or target their resources in a particular way. And that austerity context actually comes to matter an awful lot, because it's important to recognize that these systems are being implemented in a context where they are being negotiated all the time. It's not just a smooth implementation. So frontline staff and managers are all sort of negotiating how to integrate these systems into their decision-making processes. And the question around austerity matters because it comes to, although in our discussion around this, it was always emphasized that professional judgment comes before the machine, right? This is always kind of said. But the question is, in practice, in this kind of context where there are these questions of a lack of resources, that is really a key question as to what does that mean in practice? How much does professional judgment come to matter when you're pushed for time and resources and the machine is telling you that someone is high risk? You know, how can you not sort of use that for, or how do you not follow the machine, as it were? And that was a continuous tension, by the way, amongst everybody around the extent to which the machine gets to decide and the professional gets to decide. And what we found also is there really isn't any standard practice around what is appropriate use of data. So we found that some local authorities do think that it's useful for this kind of very individualized profiling, whereas others really don't see this as being an appropriate use of data. So that also means that there isn't really a standard kind of understanding of what is sort of how to handle data or what is appropriate to do. Now, and so in this kind of implementation and use, there is a recognition of some kind of trade-off, but often that trade-off is about the question of privacy, right? And then protection of vulnerability and the duty of care, and that's the sort of trade-off that councils are having to engage with. And that means that the sort of auditing that gets done is predominantly on error rates within the technology, so it's very confined understanding of the auditing process, and then they also audit the extent to which it gets used, so the extent to which frontline staff actually pick it up and use the system for their work. So what we found is a kind of lack of any broader impact assessment that would consider how is this actually changing practices? Does it change how people act? Does it actually impact on certain communities in particular way? Those kinds of broader sort of social questions are not really taken on, in part because they don't have the resources to do it, and it's also difficult to know how you would do a proper impact assessment. And we also found that there was had been very little consultation with citizens about the implementation of these systems, and also, in many cases, not really a proper kind of discussion around informed consent or the fact that their data now was being used for these types of purposes. And that matters. So what we see is when we spoke then to civil society, the kinds of concerns, and these are then civil society groups that work with service users. So we also spoke with the British Association for Social Workers, for example, but also disability activists and other welfare rights organizations. And what we saw there is that there is a dominant, as well as digital rights organizations, and there is a concern about the sheer extent of data collection and sharing. So the very sensitive data that councils hold on people and who actually gets access to that. That was a prominent concern amongst civil society groups. But also this question about how these systems tend to have issues of bias and discrimination in them. And particularly how sort of stereotyping can become reinforced, because what is it that gets weighted as a risk factor, right? Is it simply being poor, for example, right? And does that then lead to issues of targeting and stigmatization? So stigmatization was a real concern among civil society groups. What right do we have to attribute a score, a risk score to someone? What right do we have to categorize and label people on the basis of this, right? And then questions around process. So question of this concern with the lack of consent, concern with lack of oversight. And then also recognition that actually the regulation we have in place, for example, like data protection regulation, is probably too limited to really deal with these kinds of questions. So what regulatory frameworks do we actually have in place to deal with these types of developments? And then I think the last point is also interesting because there was a recognition or a concern expressed by civil society that this really isn't about the technology, but it is about what policy agenda is being advanced through the use of this technology. And that's something that I think perhaps doesn't get talked about that much, where there was a question about this is, so, you know, they would say, well, we'll know that they will categorize us and this will become punitive very quickly because really what they want to do is not provide us with a needs-based understanding of services, and this will become, therefore, punitive. So that was a concern that was expressed. And so and I think what's interesting here is just to sort of recognize the difference in concerns, right? So what we found in terms of, with speaking with public sector workers, often the concerns would be about data quality issues, for example, and then trying to deal with error rates and things like this. But these kinds of broader social questions didn't really feature so much in the concerns that were raised within local authorities. So we have some discrepancy here. And then just to end, I just want to highlight sort of some things that we're sort of grappling with are sort of broader political implications of the use or the implementations of these systems within these kinds of governance spaces. So whether we have to sort of talk about a broader transformation. So what role these technologies have in a transformation of governance and in a transformation in the relationship between state and citizens. Because what does this golden view actually mean? And we know from sort of critical data studies and those kinds of fields that often these systems are based on trying to abstract very complex social relations and identities, which often means that it's a quite reductionist view of people. So this question, what does it mean to view people through data points in this way and in a kind of score? And importantly, what counts? And that comes to matter, for example, in something like for the child welfare case, where we had even the developer for that system in Bristol said, you know, we can only account for these risk factors to do with school attendance or to do with history of domestic. My microphone's, oh, it's back on. So these kinds of questions, but they can't account for more complex information that might be insulating factors, right? So that they are very active in the community, or that they have grandparents that take care of them, or these kinds of more sort of that require a sort of different engagement perhaps with families. And that was recognized and highlighted that it is a particular view and perhaps a quite reductionist view that we get. Then this broader question about the fact that these technologies are often optimized for identifying and capturing risk. And when we spoke to also people working within local authorities, that often means that therefore they have become predominantly risk managers, but also that, that the kind of logic, the operative logic is risk management, but also that the nature of this risk moves towards being very sort of personalized because it's attributed to an individual or to a household. And therefore, the question is the extent to which becomes the extent to which this can engage with underlying causes of social problems, and the extent to which then this leads to a sort of individualized policy agenda where you engage with social issues by dealing with the individual household, the individual offender, but without looking at questions of, say, what's happening in terms of inequality or rise in homelessness or these kinds of social issues. The extent to which policy comes to prioritize these individualized responses. And then finally, this question about who is then the experts in these contexts. So if there is a transfer of expertise to these calculative devices, what happens to professional judgment? How can professionals, how do they feel within this context, the extent to which they feel empowered to be making decisions based on their expertise, as it were? What expertise comes to count? So those are just kind of some of the things that we're sort of thinking about. What role does these systems have in broader sort of transformations? And I'll end it there. Thank you. Thank you.